Before the break, I discussed the Trump administration rightfully opening diplomatic channels with both Iran and Hamas, and some of the blowback he is getting, most notably right now from Israel. Today, Israel's Channel 12 is reporting that Trump team's talks with Hamas actually started earlier than previously reported. In fact, they started shortly before Trump was even inaugurated. Joining me now to discuss this and what it all means, Mouin Rabbani. He is the co-editor of Jadaliyya and a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Mouin, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with this Trump and Hamas, backdoor channel talks, these direct talks. What do you think the significance of this is, of both Trump dealing with Hamas directly and apparently doing so behind Israel's back without their knowledge and against their wishes?
Well, I think it's very significant. I mean, talking to adversaries or enemies, or even talking to all parties involved in a conflict is kind of standard diplomatic practice when you're trying to resolve a crisis. And given the concerns the U.S. has about this transforming into a regional war that could directly suck in the United States, I think it's on that basis that the Americans decided they needed to talk to one of the main players in this crisis, which is Hamas, particularly because I think the Americans have also concluded that Israel will do everything within its power to derail the agreement, the ceasefire agreement that went into effect in January and is supposed to reach its second stage already.
What about Hamas in all of this? I mean, their side of things. What does having a direct line to the American administration do for them? Because, again, Trump has openly said he wants to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip, certainly depopulate it. He uses the word Palestinian as a slur. He is obviously no friend of the Palestinians. But what's the advantage for Hamas in being able to deal directly with a Trump administration that has made no love lost very clear to them?
Well, I don't think Hamas, or for that matter, any Palestinians have illusions about either Trump or the United States, given the full-scale support of his predecessor, Joe Biden, for Israel's genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip. But I think their ability to communicate their points of view directly to the Americans and to emphasize the importance of implementing the agreement that has already been signed in January, rather than trying to replace it with something new and different, and making clear to the Americans that while Trump may think that Palestinians would love to move to the Sinai Desert or Jordan or whatever, that they're staying put and not going to capitulate. I think being able to communicate this directly to the Americans would be very important for them, particularly given that Trump, without those negotiations, the Americans are hearing the Palestinian perspective either from the Israelis or indirectly via the mediators, Egypt and Qatar.
Let's compare this for what we saw last week with Ukraine. I mean, whatever anyone thinks about the Russia-Ukraine issue, when Trump and Zelensky met in the Oval Office, we saw for a moment an American president forcefully tell an ally that it will stop sending U.S. weapons unless it changes its behavior. Basically, America trying to impose its will on an ally to get its desired outcome. Could you envision Trump doing this, even privately, not even publicly, even privately, with Netanyahu?
Not really, but, having said that, and as you pointed out earlier, Trump is a very erratic, unpredictable, and impulsive leader. So, in principle, anything is possible. I think the real issue here is not whether Trump is going to turn on Israel, which, of course, theoretically could happen because he doesn't have this passionate ideological attachment to Israel that, for example, Joe Biden did. I think the greater risk here is that Trump will make unrealistic proposals to the Palestinians, to Hamas, and when these are rejected, that he could then become, very belligerent and authorize Israel to derail the agreement and resume its genocidal military campaign at the Gaza Strip in an intensified fashion.
There was also, and I'm not sure if you saw it, on the difference between Ukraine and Israel, conservative New York Times columnist Ross Douthat posted, fundamentally, I suspect Trump's attitudes towards Israel and toward Ukraine may be somewhat similar, that he regards them both as rogue allies that need to be forced into deal-making, but he's more constrained by GOP Zionism than by GOP Ukraine hawks. What do you think of that idea, that even if he wanted to cut Israel loose like he's doing with Ukraine, or kind of put some pressure on them, he wouldn't be able to do that because of his own party and the Republican Party and the political pressures in the Republican Party?
I don't buy that. I mean, Trump has basically completely transformed the Republican Party in multiple ways on both domestic and foreign policy. And if there's one thing we learned during the past year and a half that we should have known before but perhaps didn't, is that Israel is entirely dependent on the United States, militarily, politically, and diplomatically. So the idea that somehow Washington is an Israeli colony is completely absurd. It's quite clear that in this relationship, the United States is a superpower, Israel is the proxy, and whatever Washington instructs Israel to do at the end of the day, the Israeli government will have no option but to comply. So, of course, you know, the Israel lobby has influence. There are congressmen who are bought and paid for and all the rest of it. But when push comes to shove, and we have voluminous evidence over the years to demonstrate this, Israel will have no choice but to comply with American policy.
And let me finally get your thoughts on the Iran talks, just in how it may impact what happens with Hamas. Could there be a deal between the U.S. and Iran that essentially forces Iran out of proxies and supporting proxies, whether it be in a much weakened Hezbollah in Lebanon and there's certainly much more tattered Hamas in the Gaza Strip?
I think that's unlikely. I mean, when you consider during the past 8 years, the first Trump administration unilaterally renouncing the international agreement that was known as Iran nuclear agreement, and then the Biden administration refusing to rejoin that agreement unless it was fundamentally revised, the Americans have almost gone out of their way to demonstrate to the Iranians that they're unreliable and untrustworthy. And so there is a real opportunity for constructive diplomacy here. But, you know, when it goes together with bluster and threats, it's going to make it very difficult for the Iranians to engage constructively with them. And I think they're going to insist on first resolving the issue of U.S.-Iranian relations before addressing any regional issues. And I think, you know, regarding your question, they consider this a matter of Iranian national security and regional policy, which at the end of the day, they will argue is none of Washington's business.
Mouin Rabbani, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime.